Hey everybody, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Trickster remakes this White House, booby traps and body/body humor in post-election prankster Biden memes, by Gina Jorgensen and Linda Lee. I really like this chapter. This is from a book on folklore and social media that came out just in 2020. So it's a reasonably new article, and of course it's a reasonably new one because the events that it talks about are didn't occur until 2016 and 2017. So what I like about this is obviously the content. I'm going to be talking about the content a little bit because I like the idea of um, like the looking at the historical moment and seeing the expressions that emerge at a particular topical time. We're basically dealing with what Russell Frank calls news lore, this folklore that exists primarily online. Frank would suggest primarily online, that exists in part because it requires an understanding of the events in order to the events of the day and actually for it to make sense, and you are rewarded by understanding those. So news lore is an entire category of folklore study, which nevertheless it builds on other understandings of folklore, so it fits into any kind of conception, but it uses news as a content. One of the things that therefore is kind of critical with the idea of news lore is that um, it kind of has like a sell by date, as it were. So as you are studying it, sometimes these things are only exist in these little blips. Now, with internet culture, of course, we have the benefit of persistence through time, and things are archived. But what news lore really underscores is there is something that the community shares, community, and we'll just put community in quotes for a second, but the community shares, is undergoing, is experiencing, that it's getting through media, it's getting through popular culture, it's getting through its typical news sources, and it comments upon them. One of the ways it comments upon them is the way it comments upon almost everything, using the aesthetic forms that are appropriate to its form of community. And by doing so, it starts to move away from the sort of objective idea of news to some kind of personal subjectivity. News lore, one of the things that it does is it kind of intimates, it doesn't answer it fully, but it kind of intimates, what do we think about this thing? And that's kind of an interesting way, and a very relevant way of looking at folklore as a kind of barometer of culture and barometer of sentiment and barometer of affectivity, because it is about framing things in some kind of artistic way, often joke, not exclusively, but often in forms of joke. But it is temporal. I mean, it happens, and then something else happens, and then something else happens. And so news lore kind of clusters. Because the flip side of that is that news lore doesn't persist. And so an old-fashioned folklorist wouldn't necessarily consider news lore the object proper of a folklorist, because it doesn't have, as a content, it doesn't have persistence through time, with very rare exceptions. Very, very rare exceptions. Most of the time, the whole point is that they are immediate. But much of folklore is immediate. It has to do with people who are gathering together and communicating in artistically understood ways that are pressing and immediate and are of the now. And folklore is not always the enactment of some kind of persistence through time. That being said, the form in which these things take place are traditional, and the form in which, and the content often will go back to motifs, themes that are present within the culture. Now, how do we argue that something like a meme, which is what the content of Gina and Linda's article is, qualifies in this aspect? Because clearly memes don't exist um, in a time prior to the ability to create them, in a time prior to the quick digital manipulation of images that allows one to juxtapose word and image and then transmit them in some particular way. But that really, in many ways, that sort of forms the second half of the article, because um, first of all, we want to recognize that there is a community. So remember a couple of minutes ago I said just put community in quotes. The folklorist has historically looked at groups that are present to each other in some way. Once we start looking away from these categories, these abstract categories like nationhood and so on, and we start locating them in places like actual people doing the ethnographic work and seeing these items that aren't just simply somehow exist in a repertoire, but really only exist in a repertoire because people actively perform and re-perform them and make them new, and that change is a consequence of making it new as opposed to poorly performing them. We then get the second question about, well, what if they're not actually present to each other? Because we still have that holdover of face-to-face communication. And so what the internet does is obviously it breaches that notion that people need to be actually present to each other. We'd already had eruptions in that idea, but the idea of, well, what happens when you have the telephone that is a medium of communication, and yet even though you have to adapt the kind of small talk conversations that happen over telephone because it isn't a visual medium, nevertheless you begin to have the actual sort of communication that creates and sustains and reaffirms collegiality and intimacy among people is still nevertheless sustainable. What happens when you talk about entering into the medium of writing? What happens when you talk about entering the medium of the photocopy and so on in office work? And that so the groundwork that media and mediated forms are easily part of folk culture had already been present. The idea that you don't necessarily need to be in the same room. And then the internet allows for people who are radically dispersed to nevertheless have a sense of being virtually present to each other, in part through the sharing of objects. There are conditions. You do want to sort of recognize that there is something about the sort of the instantaneous nature of internet communications is still serialized in a way that face-to-face isn't quite, and that most things are in like sort of text message. It's virtually bidirectional, but it isn't like the multidirectionality of first person. It's not even the multidirectionality of FaceTime or Zoom or Skype. It is basically a thing, as opposed to the more Bakhtinian dialogue of voices that are happening at the same time, out of which you can sort of start to discern some kind of pattern. So, nevertheless, you have a group that is present to itself and present through the performances themselves. Present, they do not need to be, we go back to our classic definitions of folk group, and it is two or more people who share at least one thing in common, and the things that they share in common are typically often contextual and situational in terms of they're from the same place and they know each other. They might have a deep set of additional social identity pairings beyond the actual moment of performance. On the internet, they might only have the moment of performance or the history of performances of this type, and yet fundamentally have no other relationship to each other. So the groups doesn't mean that they are not sincere, doesn't mean that there's not great meaning in them, but they are fundamentally different. Memes, at the same time, we can also be recognizing that as new media present itself to the folk, as they are able to avail themselves of a technology, they use it, and they can create first, they can sort of echo forms that might exist in a different kind of medium into this medium. But just as importantly, new forms are created, new ones emerge. Going back to the classic idea, classic in terms of I'm always saying it, I might be the only person who says it, but I think it's classic. The folk are always contemporary to their times. The act of being traditional, when they sort of putting on their I'm going to do something as traditional, They might intentionally push away certain media as a genuine way of doing that, certain aesthetic forms, certain instruments when we're talking about music, and they might say, no, in order to do it this way, I am precluded from certain options, and that's fine. But that's a consequence. Those are a consequence of their decisions and their aesthetic judgments. It is not a necessary condition when they are engaged in the act of, I am communicating with other people in artistically interesting ways, which they might not never say out loud, but basically, hey, I've got a cool thing to do. They will use whatever influences and whatever technologies that they have access to. And so the creation of memes is basically doing something functionally that shares the same function, that shares the same purpose as other forms of folklore, except they're doing it in a way that couldn't have been done before because digital technology allows this. So memes become these opportunities for this artistic communication in a small group, a group that is not known to each other necessarily, or at least not present to each other necessarily, and yet it is expressive. And because it's expressive, and because it really is a folk communication, it doesn't, the act of sharing, for one thing, is just as important as the act of creating. Originality is not necessarily a requirement, and we can have people who just simply communicate in terms of being nodes of sharing, and when new ones are created, they're typically created according to established patterns. So again, from a negative perspective, if you were an artist, you might be considering a lot of sort of mimetic culture derivative or formulaic, but derivative and formulaic are not disparaging or derogations when we talk about folk culture, because it is, I am doing this thing, I am doing this thing, I am doing this thing in this way, I am making changes to it, but I'm also doing this thing because this is the way we do things, and so it communicates in that way. So we have this moment in time. We have the period, the interregnum period between the end of the 2016 election, when Trump won the majority of the electoral college votes, and there was still the how long is it? 8 weeks between 8 or 10 weeks between that time and the official swearing in. So what happens when one is preparing for the next president, particularly when the next president is the president that ended up being in the place? And then you have Biden. So you have Biden, who's already, obviously he's a real person, but he is also a character. And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about news lore, and interesting about folklore in general, especially when we start talking about joke traditions and humor traditions, is that we are dealing with people who are both exist in the real world and yet have already been narrativized. And they've been narrativized within a whole cycle of forms that are not necessarily meant to be understood as entirely coterminous with the real life historical figure, and yet are clearly informed by them. So they point out, and I've written in places, the whole Biden's portrayal in The Onion, for example, as washing his hot rod in the driveway, and a whole sort of theme of Biden as this kind of like cool, not particularly trustworthy uncle figure had already been established, based in part on the fact that he is prone to gaffes, and he's prone to a couple of as they go into enough detail, prone to a couple of inconsistencies with how he perhaps should best be presenting himself as a cis white male in the 21st century. You can read, you probably know about it. I don't want to dwell too much. But so he becomes this character. And the thing that I really like about this article is not only is it an exploration of memes, but what it's really doing is saying, here's this brand new event. So clearly there is not precedent in terms of a semantic content of Trump's eventual entry into the White House. And clearly, we are dealing with an emerging form in terms of memes that are maybe by 2016, 2017. What do you want to say generously? 8 years old, 10 years old? When do you want to start? Maybe we put them at more or less coincident with the beginning of Facebook. So 2005. How about we say that? So whatever. You can point a pin in when memes started, but still an emerging form, but only an emerging form, and so clearly without precedent. And yet, what they bring to it, what Gina and Linda bring to it, is a nice, thick, classic history of folklore. Both the idea of looking at these ethnographically and doing the Dundesian texture context approach. They were both students of, well, certainly Gina was a student of Dundee's. I think Linda was as well, but definitely Gina of Alan Dundee's. So you have that approach to it. Let's not simply look at these memes as memes, but look at these memes as they are shared. What is the actual context and the texture in which they are shared? Because when you share something online, not the cynic would suggest that there is no sort of folk process. It's just simply this cutting and pasting. And first, memes allow for much more creativity than the cutting and pasting. But second, you have reactions to it. You have an audience that says something. Or conversely, you could share and say, eye roll, you could share and put happy face, you could share and put, barfing emoticon, you can share and disagree, you can share and say LOL, you can share and say this kind of stuff is crazy. And you can actually be sharing it while disapproving of it, and then someone else can pick it up and share it differently. Conversely, people will react to it, and you'll find an audience, and what groups you share it to, and what families you share it to. So these are not, even though they are, as they say, intextuable, they have a, the meme literally has a frame around it you can pluck out, and you can turn it into an object. They're never shared objectively. They are shared. They are communicated, and that is their ultimate form, and their ultimate value is that even if the actual thing itself doesn't vary from iteration to iteration, the interpretation as it does changes, because and that's the folk dynamic. There's a whole bunch of people who are engaged in rebroadcasting it. So even though this is a new form with a new content, they look at it folkloristically in two ways. One, the idea that this is something that is being communicated, and the act of communication is as important as the thing itself. And secondly, they start bringing out the heavy numbers in terms of, let's look at these things as sort of literary text. Who is Biden in the prankster Biden imaginary? In this particular moment, at this particular moment in time, end of November to January 2016 to January of 2017, this fairly narrow window, felt like an eternity, but a fairly narrow window of time. Who is this person? Who is this additional person? If we're talking about Obama, who is typically in the background or implied in many of these. These are often conversational memes where he's directing some text towards the former president. Who is Trump at this time, who's never depicted but is clearly always being referenced, and who are sort of the other ancillary characters. Melania Trump, the former first lady, or who was to be the next first lady, Mike Pence, the vice presidential nominee, and subsequently who was going to be Biden's replacement, and so on. So you have this, you locate, okay, how are we meant to understand him? And we're meant to understand him as the figure of the trickster. The trickster is a complicated figure in folklore, and it's a complicated invocation. And I'm not going to take them to task in any stretch, because I'm not the person who should be doing that. But there was if you look at sort of the history of the trickster figure, and you read contemporary First Nations writers and critics, and they have in some ways said, let's maybe put a pin in just reducing everything to trickster. Certainly on the level of white critics. But certainly on the level of white critics when they are discussing First Nations material. So it's like, okay, I'm tentative about doing that because I've been asked to be tentative about doing that, and I just want to hear that. Nevertheless, they do make a compelling argument. The idea of the trickster as understood is not someone who is malevolent, but neither someone who is particularly innocent either. Rather, the idea is that they introduce chaos. It's arguable that one of the things that the trickster does is introduces merely the complication of plot, and so at which point you start almost calling any villain a trickster, and I think that is really a usurpation of the term. But the idea that they are the instruments by which complications arise, and when they do something, they are not doing it for their own gain. They are not doing it to do a malevolent act. They are doing it to see what the reactions are. It's a kind of a neat thing, and so locating Biden within that context, in that right now he's not there to punish, he's not there to inflict harm, he's there to confuse, he's there to addle, and that is basically what he's trying to achieve. It's an interesting aspect, doubly so when we bring in the gender dynamics that Gina and Linda are so very good at. Gina's other work has to do with a fairy tale, particularly. I mean, she's done much other work, but one of her significant contributions is the idea of how the body, and the female body in particular, has been depicted in traditional tales. She's used digital analysis, computer analysis of corpuses of tales to bring that out. Some really fascinating work. Linda, meanwhile, has done some wonderful idea on the correlation between fairy tale and the romance novel, and then doubly so romance novels that have fairy tale settings. That's sort of one of her areas of expertise. So they're both highly attuned to the issue of the depiction of gender, the depiction of traditional masculinity and femininity within tales, and then how that and how those are often limitations. So certainly, if we start looking at the tale as some kind of presumptive model for how things ought to be, the sort of the evolution of the fairy tale over the 19th century as something that is meant to have a kind of pedagogic function, and something that is meant to model right and wrong. Well, when you start talking about beauty and the body, you start having the sort of I'll undermine the point by merely calling it problematic, but the problematic depiction of what comprises the beautiful and what comprises the ugly, what comprises the able-bodied and what comprises the disabled body, and so on. So you need to be cautious about these things. And the idea that Biden is playing around with his problematic idea of, if not necessarily of masculinity, then at least of male and cis male privilege. How do you do that in contrast with the even more problematic, again, a weak word for this, but the even more problematic history of Trump's own cis male privilege and the allegations, the far more severe allegations that had been, and express actions, and at least express comments that had been already attributed to him. How do these memes kind of reflect on that? How do they take these things that are present and introduce some kind of critique that doesn't stop criticism directed towards Biden, because Biden is more like a creature in these memes of fun and interest and delight than necessarily sympathy. We are not necessarily meant to, if we are meant to, let me think about this. If we are meant to sympathize or see ourselves as representative in Biden's actions, simultaneously, we're not necessarily meant to feel too good about it. Just like, hey, yeah, that's kind of what I would do. So that kind of earnestness, basically, that we wish him to do a little bit of mischief, because the person against whom he's doing so much mischief is someone we have far less sympathy for. So it's kind of, we're momentarily siding not necessarily with the angels, but dot dot dot. And so just drawing from traditional of these traditional figures, and then using, the what Trevor Blank calls the cultural inventory, these easy references, some to the history, the reference pool that is about this news itself, some to aspects of popular culture, the references to Horcruxes from the Harry Potter universe and so on. It's like, okay, all right, I get what's going on here, and the idea that the reader, the viewer of the meme, is rewarded. This is a concept that is kind of really important in internet culture, and Lynn McNeil's written about this. The idea of gleaning, the idea that she gets gleaning from Barry Tolkien, but the idea that one of the rewards of internet culture is the fact that it is drawn from so many things, that references can be juxtaposed with each other and things can be brought together. So you have the image, the file footage, the almost the stock image of Biden and Obama in various poses. You have then the juxtaposition of text, and then the content of the text might make reference to other popular culture things, and you are rewarded if you understand. So if you just invoke the word Horcrux, you don't need the explanatory comma for it to make sense. You get aha, I know what's going on here. And so again, the hybridity that takes place within it, and we glean it. We just like, oh, okay, I get it. I'm getting what's happening in this creative act, and we are rewarded because we are. At one point, we're rewarded because it's nice to recognize things. Another thing, it kind of references the idea that there is a community there that I am a part of because I know the content, because I have gleaned. Therefore, my world is just that much richer. It's kind of a neat idea. So they can draw from anything because, again, the folk are always contemporary to their times, and they will take whatever is at their disposal, not simply technology, not simply the semantic content of the news, but the whole cultural inventory of references, knowing that for the most part, their audience is going to understand it, depending, of course, on where they send it, but knowing that their audience is going to understand it, and the audience will feel rewarded, and status will be accorded even to the anonymized creator of the meme, and subsequently, perhaps the sender of the meme. The fact that one of the things to bear in mind, for both good purposes and ill, is that so many internet creations lose contact with the originator, that they just become sort of part of the collective ownership. Positively, you have this sort of wonderful generosity of wellspring of creativity. Negatively, no one needs necessarily be responsible for something that they put out into the world that can, some stuff can delight and some stuff can horrify and be insightful and be about, not about joy, but about violence. And it's like, well, no one's responsible for that. If we, this is the payoff of introducing wonderful stuff into the world, is we can also use those same mechanisms to introduce tragic stuff into the world. So was traditional folklore, for that matter. Let's never forget that a lot of the things that we study, actually, let me rephrase that. A lot of the things that we don't study them because the group either A, refuses to share them with folklorists, or B, finally expunged them from their own performance contexts. But traditional folklore is just a regular vehicle for hatred and malice and exclusion and all the isms and phobias that you can suggest that are present in contemporary communication. It's just that with the rosy colored glasses of looking at the past and how a group might wish to see itself presented, and hopefully with the arc of history is long but bending towards justice idea of slowly purgating some of those elements. We don't necessarily always see that when we look at the past, because it is that they tend to disappear. They tend to be silenced. The thing about internet culture is that we get to see everything. So it's not that today is a particularly heinous time. It's just that the heinousness is not in the shadows the way it was. Hey, that was a bummer to end this discussion on, because these are so much fun. I remember collecting. I didn't collect them per se, but I remember witnessing them, and I was writing about them at the time. And I reference them in a piece of writing that I do, and I've written about certainly about how Biden was presented in The Onion. I just love this article, and I just love the way that it is both incredibly aware of chapter. I keep on calling it article, but that's the way I roll. It's incredibly aware that this is a new phenomenon and needs to be addressed in with respect to its new phenomenon. We can't just simply put on our old dowdy folklore robes and say and kind of erase those factors that don't fit into our classic folklore models. We need to understand that there are dynamics in play that are different from face-to-face communications, and they need to be taken seriously. While at the same time, so once we establish that, it's like, yeah, but look how traditional this stuff is. Look, it's doing the same kind of thing that folklore always does. Look, it's referencing the same kind of pools that folklore always does. So even though I know this, I can still bring this toolkit to it. So it becomes this wonderful example of digital folklore. All right. I really don't have much of anything else to say. My name is Ian. I have been talking about Gina Jorgensen and Linda Lee's. She goes by Linda J. Lee, but I know her as Linda. And then their chapter, Trickster Remakes This White House, Booby Traps and Body/Body Humor in Post-Election Prankster Biden Memes. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.